Many feel that the pass rates for the new standards has been very disappointing. Are we prepared for endpoint assessment, and how can things be improved?
And well, we've certainly touched on some of these issues, so again, it gives a chance to perhaps highlight the most important thing that the panel wants to see improved. But it's also difficult to know whether the new standards, what the pass rates are at the moment. Very difficult to know. But Richard's got some personal experience and mentioned it in his first response.
Yeah, so as I say, the standards are designed that people will fail. You know, if everybody passes, then it won't have worked. I don't think it's like GCSEs where the figures will be manipulated so that pass rates stay at 67.6%, because that's seen as a good figure. So I think people are hoping it'd be higher than it was. But there's all sorts of considerations with this and some perverse incentives. I think when the standards were put together, it was assumed that the standard would be a qualification and would be worth getting on its own. Actually, if you've seen, put your hand up if you've seen a standard certificate here. Anybody seen one? Yeah? They're pretty unimpressive, aren't they? It's pieces of paper, yeah? If you look at the money in your pocket signed by the, Bank of England and stamped by the Queen, and it looks pretty impressive, and you could take it somewhere, and this is backed by the Bank of England, The endpoint assessment certificate is just a blank piece of paper. It doesn't really talk about who's approving you, who's putting their reputation on the line. So actually, what's the value of it? And if you're doing an apprenticeship that contains, I don't know, chartered accountancy, and you've passed your chartered accountancy qualifications, you're a fully qualified accountant with letters after your name, licensed to practice, oh, and by the way, you've got to go and do this endpoint assessment down the road on top. Why would you bother? Why would your employer want to pay 20% and have you out the business for 3 days to do that? So I think that there's all sorts of perverse incentives, so we'll have to really be careful with to make sure that success rates don't fail. I agree, there's no timely success rates being produced by the ESFA for last year because nobody knows what's happening. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be measuring them ourselves, because someone will ask us one day and we all want to be able to make sure that things are going well. So I think less people will go for endpoint assessment. I think actually what will happen is you just won't pass people through Gateway. So the success rates will be very high, but it will be a smaller section. And that'll be like A-levels, People get off-roll, don't they, if they're not going to pass. So actually they have really high success rates, and I suspect we're in that kind of territory now, but it won't be the whole picture.
I suppose that from my personal perspective, it sounds a bit disappointing if where we end up is lots of people deciding not to bother with the end assessment. Yeah. But the other point I think I picked from your answer was that the qualification is and continues to be an important part of the whole apprenticeship package, and maybe we should think of a way of merging the two. It is a possible route through.
It's a bit like the current system, the previous system, isn't it? So if you didn't get all your functional skills, but you passed your NVQ and your tech cert, then some apprentices didn't complete their functional skills.
True. So that's true.
It's similar, but to answer your question directly, I don't think we were ready. I think it's like I said earlier, it's a new system. I think there's some confusion between providers, some employers, particularly the smaller employers who are taking on apprentices, of what endpoint assessment actually involves. I know in our case, the apprentices didn't really know what it involves. So I go back to what I said earlier about it being really important that one, the APO is in place, but two, that the employer, the provider, and the APO are working together right from the get-go, and there are some clear materials and structure that can support the apprenticeship program from day one. The more you can have the endpoint assessment organisation involved, like going in to meet with the students beforehand, the better. Yep. I think the requirements around gateway and resits and who pays what, all of that needs to be tightened up, because I think at the moment where you have an apprentice who has to remain with that employer until they complete their endpoint assessment. So if you've got an apprentice, for example, who's working on the apprenticeship minimum wage, then until they go through, they've done all components of their apprenticeship program, but they're on apprenticeship minimum wage until they can do their endpoint assessment. But there's not enough assessors to do that, so you're longing it out. There needs to be some real structure and standardization around the gateway. and what that looks like in practice.
And I think, if it's not to miss the point, make the point too obvious, but that issue around actually the endpoint assessment is for the apprentice, really, and the employer. And if we forget that, and it all becomes part of the funding debate and how training providers can manage it, it'll be a real shame. Because to hold anybody up when they're ready for their end assessment would be a travesty, I think.
Yeah, I think agreeing that is important between, it's like a tripartite agreement, isn't it? But I think, at least within our sector, where we have apprentices that are working, say, on a TV production, that's a very fixed period of time. And the challenge that we're having at the moment is if that production, you're on a production for 12 months, it's done. There is nowhere for you to stay and you can't remain with that production to do endpoint assessment.
Yeah.
So where you have companies who, are paying into this levy, it's like, well, actually, I can't even recoup it because the system isn't working for me.
The one thing I think is pretty clear, if we haven't made that clear, the training provider will be held responsible for their pass rate, in essence. They won't be held responsible for the timely pass rate, which I think is a good thing, but they will be held responsible for their pass rates. And I don't suppose too many employers will want a whole range of people not reaching the end point assessment. So what's very clear is training providers and awarding organisations whose future will also depend on that will need to find a way to make sure that the pass rates are high.
There's two pieces, of what I've seen in relation to pass rates is I've seen a huge divide in actually provider behaviour here. So, some providers really got behind it, realised we are moving from a task-based delivery model to learning, where I think we will see success. They've built new curriculums, there's been an investment in upskilling their current trainers, staff, and I think we will see great success and good pass rates there. We have also, though, got a number of people who haven't, for whatever reason, busy or just a misunderstanding of how big this change is, who the amount of times I've gone in to talk about endpoint assessment is, and the answer has been, we will not even consider you unless you can give us workbooks. Workbooks is not going to get somebody and support them through endpoint assessment. And I think we are going to see that divide of the success and non-success of different providers within that in relation to that. And I think this is where Ofsted actually could play a part in helping that full understanding of that leap from task to actually learning that we are seeing a number of providers make, which will help support that success. But some are actually catching up and they are going to need some help and support to get where we need to if we are going to have the success rates.
I think providers that sort of think that they've reached the gateway, made the claim for their 20% and can leave the assessment to someone else, I think will have to learn a pretty hard lesson. So I'm sure over time that
I think there is also the responsibility, I think, for endpoint assessment organisations where we can't say our job only starts at gateway. Unless we're supporting, providing that infrastructure, making sure people are prepared by practice questions, exemplars, mock assessments, then we haven't played our part either. So it is a whole change in behaviour and ways of working that, we've all got a part to play in that if we're going to make this a success and get those success rates.
And just from an employer's perspective, do you see the pass rate as something that's important to you? And
it's extremely important.
Right.
No employer brings in an apprentice to fail.
No, sure.
And, we would never, it would have to be an exception to stop at the gateway for an individual. We would do everything in our power to get them prepped and prepared. And we celebrate every year our apprentices' successes and we bring them all together. And the last thing we'd want is to have an apprentice sitting there thinking, I can't celebrate because I haven't achieved. And that's unfair on them.
Okay.
I think it will impact the onboarding, the recruitment side a lot more. Because we are really readjusting and rethinking the way we do that initial assessment process because we're coming through to do our first cohort as a training provider of endpoint assessment. And I think we're definitely looking at our candidate pool beforehand and as well as the role in a lot more within the employer to make sure that there is that capacity to be able to deliver.
And that's why not having an endpoint assessment available at the beginning seems crazy, which comes back to that previous point.